Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Sanford, Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative and Vice President and Chief Product Security Officer for Energy Management for Schneider Electric. Thank you for joining our panel discussion today, Beyond Hope as a Strategy, New Models for Public and Private Collaboration. This discussion is part of our 9/12 competition. This is part of our 9/12 Strategy Challenge and our global cyber policy and strategy competition. Panelists include Wendy Nather, who is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative and also Head of Advisory CISOs at Cisco. We also have Morgan Adamski with us, who is the Chief of the NSA's Collaboration Center. And lastly, we have Kristen Todd with us, who is the Chief of Staff for CISA at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So for our first question, I'm going to kick it over to Wendy Nather first, and what are the current trends, implications, and future possibilities that you see in the way of public-private collaboration going forward?
Well, there's so many things there that I could opine on, but I think I'm just going to go for it and grab the stage and go on a quick rant about one thing that I think is really, really important that we should be doing, especially with CISA's leadership, and that is building a mechanism for secure ad hoc communications between the government and among people in the private sector, among organizations. When I was working for an ISAC, the biggest problem I had was trying to reach out to somebody at the last minute when I'd never talked to them before and said, no, really, I'm from this group. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I have some important breach information that I need to give to you. And so the more that we can build a mechanism like this, not just among the ISACs and ISAOs and not just among the existing agencies and the large companies that are used to communicating with CISA and other organizations on this, but anybody we might have to reach out to in scale who is not, does not have the expertise to be able to set up secure communication, who does not know when they're going to be getting a legitimate call about something. I think that's the most important thing we can put in place ahead of time to help with all sorts of projects in the area of public and private collaboration.
Thank you, Wendy. Morgan, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, I'm really privileged to be here with three phenomenal female panelists, so I look forward to this conversation. So one of the main things I think that's really important to emphasize is that when we talk about public-private collaboration, it is really not something that can happen after an incident. At that point, it's too late. It's something we need to be doing before, during, and after things happen. And one of the reasons I say that is because it is critical to building trust between both the government and our private sector counterparts. And by having a continuous conversation about certain threats that we're seeing, certain things that we're worried about, and the risks that we're carrying, it makes those conversations so much more rich and personal and deep. And so I think that's a really key part and something that we've learned over the past year at the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. One trend that I've really noticed, especially after we talk about public-private partnerships so much right now, is that we have this patience and willingness coming from the U.S. cybersecurity community. They've done a phenomenal job as we've tried to figure out how do we do this operational collaboration. And when you do this type of collaboration on an ongoing basis, and you come to the table and you say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, it takes a certain degree of humility. And I think that's one of the key things that we have to bring when we talk about trends and implications and challenges in public-private partnerships. Also, in terms of implications, I would just emphasize one thing that I think all of my colleagues can agree to. There is no perfect formula when it comes to operational collaboration in public-private partnerships. Large government meetings with senior leadership around the table is not my idea of operational collaboration, especially when it comes to public-private partnerships. It happens through personal connections, geek out sessions between analysts, which is one of the most phenomenal things I've ever watched. It happens every day and it's great to see. And the free flowing of creative thoughts and ideas and problems. That's how we get to really innovative solutions and things that allow us to get to scale when we talk about defense of the things we care the most about.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. And Kirsten?
Thanks so much, Megan, and it's great to be with everybody today, and thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. Morgan and I see each other on a weekly basis, also virtually, so it's great to be a part of this conversation. You know, it's funny because for a long time we've talked about this term public-private partnerships, and when we think about public-private partnerships, it's almost a term that's been so overused that it doesn't have any meaning. And so when we look at the last year, playing off of something that Morgan said, you know, we have this very interesting opportunity and this critical moment in cybersecurity where we've got mainstream America, the world really understanding that cybersecurity is important in a different way. There's a motivation and a momentum that we see both in industry and in government to work together. We're no longer having to make the case that this isn't something that won't happen to somebody or some industry, that this is happening and it's out there. And so there is an awareness that we have now that we haven't had, which is no one entity can protect itself by itself. We talk in government about cyber as a team sport. We talk with industry about cyber as a team sport, that we've got to do this together. So last August, as a lot of people are aware, CISA Director Easterly launched the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative to, as Morgan talked about, really push forward this idea of operational collaboration. And again, this is about the pre-event work, right? It's about building that trust. And when we look at this, you know, somebody said something to me recently in the research community, which is that people don't trust institutions, they trust people. And so much of this work is really grassroots level of building that trust, sharing information. You know, again, as both Morgan and Wendy said, it's you don't have to always have the pieces together, but it's being able to sit at the table and say, this is the data that I'm seeing, here are the data points, here are the anomalies, sharing that with industry, sharing that with government, to then put a broader puzzle together to say, what are we seeing? How can we all learn from each other? And I think particularly with Log4j, when we saw this industry government collaboration, obviously closely with NSA as well as others, it was very much about what are we all seeing, how do we need to respond? So as we look to the future, it's that operational work, you know, again, as Morgan said, before an event. So there is this natural engagement that's happening on a regular basis. We have a Slack channel set up for this Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative just to share information and bring that all together with industry resources and then government intelligence.
Kirsten, I love it. I want to hone in there the keen focus on the operational realities and the focus of sharing information at that true level and the building of trust and relationships. I don't know about you all, but I'm a tremendous Stephen Covey fan. And his law is that everything moves at the speed of trust. And I think that this is exactly the spirit that you're speaking to. I mean, mention of a Slack channel in terms of sharing information. I mean, it does feel like we're living in 2022 now, doesn't it? I'm so happy to hear this, honestly. Thank you. And Kirsten, would you mind if I actually directed the next question to you? Because I think that you'll be very well posed in your role to kind of give us ground truth, what we're hearing, what's the scoop on this. But the new cyber incident reporting law, do you mind spending maybe a minute or two just touching on with the audience what this is, why this is big? And then if you don't mind, Morgan, I'll shoot it over to you, and then Wendy will end on you with comments for this one.
No, thank you so much. I mean, I think, first of all, you know, we're so grateful to Congress for the support and having this happen, because this is something we've talked about for a long time. Because the value here, again, is that if we can share information, if we can put these data points together, us as CISA in collaboration with other agencies, with the NSA, with the FBI, then we're going to do a much better job to respond effectively. So this legislation allows and really encourages entities to report to CISA. We have a new website or new email address, report@cisa.gov, to say this is what we're seeing. And then when we get that information, we can then share it with other industries. I think one of the key issues that has certainly happened over the years, Wendy talked about ISACs, and they've been this tremendous sharing mechanism. And what we're seeing more and more now with the interdependencies of the digital economy is the importance of cross-sector information sharing. And so that's something that CISA can absolutely facilitate when this reporting is conducted, when we get that information, not just with our industry partners, but certainly with government. And so looking at that cross-sector value of sharing the information to be able to connect the dots.
Absolutely. Thank you. Morgan?
Yeah, and that's a perfect segment. I would just say, you know, one of the main things that we always talk about from a national security agency, NSA perspective, is that we have phenomenal insights into our foreign nation state actors. And that's really what drives our operational collaboration with the private sector. But that's only half the picture. And so when we look at the cyber incident reporting, like we're very excited in finding our ways of how do we build a comprehensive picture of what the threats are doing, especially in the U.S. victim space. And so, partnering with our colleagues at CISA is really important to us in this space as we build that comprehensive picture. We think it's incredibly important. One of the key missions at NSA and one of the reasons that we have a significant movement towards operational collaboration in the last year or so is our direct support to the defense industrial base. From a DoD perspective, combat support agency at NSA first and foremost, right? And so when we talk about incident reporting, it is something that the DoD has been doing for some time in the DIB in particular through our Defense Cyber Crime Center, so DC3, and they've set up a great mechanism. So being able to contribute and leverage that and work with CISA to build that even more comprehensive picture, I think is a great initiative.
Thank you. Wendy?
Well, once again, we come back to individual trust because that's how things often happen. And the breach reporting requirements are great, except for the circumstance where companies or organizations in the private sector that are under what I call the security poverty line may not even have the expertise to know when they're having a breach. And that is the big problem. So as both Morgan and Kirsten have reiterated over and over again, sometimes it just comes down to individual relationships, hopefully pre-built. I still get calls where somebody will call me and say, I know it's after hours, but I need to talk to somebody at CISA right now. Who do you know? And for those of you who have answered that calls in CISA, I'm really sorry, and I really appreciate your patience. But sometimes those sorts of things transcend the bounds of the normal constraints and formalities that we have to work with in a public and private partnership. You just do what you need to do to get done. And so I think that's really the strength of what we have today.
Thank you, Wendy. And I'll start with Morgan this time. Where do you think, Morgan, and I'll pass it over to Wendy next, and then we'll land on Kirsten lastly here. Where are you really seeing this happen today? What would you consider, what are some of the best forms of public-private collaboration today? And this can be in terms of intelligence sharing, this can be in terms of joint research, this can cover a lot of different topics, but just really ground truth public-private partnerships where they have this really good operational element that Kirsten alluded to earlier. And if we want to also take the opportunity to call out maybe some public-private partnerships that have fallen the way, that have gone the way of the past, that for whatever reason, they just fell flat. And why did it fall flat? And did we learn from it?
Okay, so that's a big question. Let me hit it in different parts. So first and foremost, let me talk about an example to talk about something where we really saw success in our public-private partnerships and collaboration. NSA has been in the cybersecurity business for close to 60 years. We used to call it information assurance, but it's been evolved. And one of the things that we have a long, rich history of is doing vulnerability analysis, understanding what are the key vulnerabilities in devices and technologies so that we can build mitigation guidance to better protect our communications, obviously for the U.S. warfighter, but also just the U.S. public in general. And so through a lot of our analysis, when we discover those vulnerabilities, we disclose them. And what we do is work with vendors to say, here's the problem we found, but we want to work with you so that we can help build a mitigation and a patch that really makes the most sense. And so most recently, an example of that is when there was a lot of vulnerabilities associated that we discovered for Microsoft Exchange. And so working in partnership with Microsoft, we have a lot of our technical experts that sit down and say, here's the in-depth vulnerability that we discovered. Let's build a mitigation guidance that can be pushed out and a patch that can be pushed out to all the net defenders in a way to better protect themselves. And let's do it as quickly as possible. So we've had a lot of success in that area. What we've done more recently over the last year and a half, it's a little bit of a difference if we spent a lot of time working with vendors to improve those products. And so instead of just telling people they have a problem, we're actually sitting down and working with them to build a solution. And I think that's really important. Secondly, I just want to pivot to a success that I think happens more often than not in the last year, which is amazing. And I'll give you a scenario because it happens all the time. We will have potentially a defense industrial base partner come to us and say, hey, we have this malicious activity generated from these IP addresses. We're really concerned about it. Is there anything that you can help us with or tell us about it? And we'll say, interesting. Most likely our adversaries are not just targeting the DIB. They tend to target multiple other sectors. So we'll share that with our DoD components. We'll share that with CISA. They'll come back and they'll say, oh, wait, we've seen this across other entities, actually. This is interesting, but we found new infrastructure associated with that same activity. We'll then take that infrastructure and share it back out to DoD and the DIB and our partners, and we found new intrusions and infrastructure we've never known about. And what I like to call this is the rinse, lather, repeat exercise, but it is actually the phenomenal things coming out of public-private partnerships. It's not just a one-way street. It's not even a two-way street. It's a multi-party conversation about here's how we're building a comprehensive understanding of what the adversary is doing. And so that is what I would say is happening every day. And we're seeing a lot more successes like that. We've seen that during SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, Pulse Secure. That has actually happened multiple times, which is great. To your last question, what doesn't work well? What doesn't work well is when we try to partner with a company or a company tries to partner with us and it's a one-way street and we have no value in the conversation. Our relationships are cooperative for a reason, meaning if we're going to bring information to the table, we need you to show up as well. And again, that goes back to the trust conversation, but it can't just be a take exercise. The government can't just take from the private sector. It has to be something that we're invested in as well, and we're sharing information out.
Great, thank you. Wendy?
All right. Well, now that Morgan has been talking about a one-way street, a two-way street, multi-way street, I suddenly had this image of a roundabout where everybody's, exchanging IOCs and talking and everything like that. Kind of crazy. So first of all, an example of public-private partnership that I think has worked really well, I have to give a shout out to Alan Friedman, who was, at NTIA, now at CISA. It was working his little heart out, first of all, on multi-stakeholder vulnerability disclosure, and now is bringing SBOMs out to the point where, they're just about ready for prime time. I think that kind of tireless effort to bring people together over years seems really hard, but over time you can see how much progress has been made. So I think that's a really great success story. An area where I think I would love to see us do more is in some of the exercises that we do. I did not take part in the most recent Cyberstorm exercise, but I did take part in one, Cyberstorm 5. And I find that those, unfortunately, are really limited because of time and because of structure, in that once the contestants or people doing the exercise find the answer to whatever it is, they declare victory and the exercise is over. But for me, I find that the really interesting and the hard work starts after you've found whatever they've decided, the public-private key pair that needs to be distributed to everyone, under the eyes of, covertly under the eyes of an adversary or something. That kind of mechanism, those logistics, I think are something we should be doing much more exercise on. It's not sexy. It's not the part of, we figured out these IOCs and we took this apart and we found the answer. We did the attribution. The hard part is actually rolling out a solution in real time, as folks at CISA and other agencies know. And I would love to see us practicing more of that unsexy hard work.
Wendy, I am 1,000% with you. And on the subject of tabletop exercises or facilitated discussions, the whole point is to get the right players in the room and then to test the efficacy of how you believe you're going to respond. And I always tell people, if you walk out of a TTX saying, we passed, we won the TTX, we beat it, you have failed. The entire goal of a tabletop exercise is to fail every time. You want to stress test your response plans to the extent that they break. You want them to break, and you want to identify where you break so that you can go back in the improvement plan and make things better next time. So the goal sometimes is to fail, is to get it wrong. And so I totally I totally resonate with the point that you make there, Wendy, about just getting in the room and maybe failing a little bit together and uncovering where we need to kind of pick things up and continue forward. And so, Kirsten, I'm going to pass the question over to you now.
Yeah, and I want to build off of that because I think it's such an important point when we're talking about trust. You know, human nature says that we often test for what we know we can respond to. And the value of these exercises is testing for the perfect storm, testing for that which will actually destroy us so that we can harden our defenses, so that we can be so much more resilient as we're looking to counter these pieces. In regard to the public-private operational collaboration success, I'll give you, I think, 3 examples. The first, I've talked about the JCDC, and one of the successes that we saw early in the fall from this was that Morgan talked about government being so good at understanding nation-state adversary activity and our intelligence, is we saw something that we then shared with our partners in the JCDC. One of those companies took that information and then they were able to apply their resources to dig much more deeply into it and then developed a report that they could then distribute to industry and to the private sector and government. And it became something where everyone could understand the tactics, the tools, the procedures that an adversary was using. And I think that was just this very interesting linear exchange of information and how something could be done. Secondly, when we think about that cooperation, we're obviously public, private, we're thinking industry and government, but I'll turn that on its side a little bit because one of the things that I was actually, Morgan talked about kind of geeking out around the table, that I was really excited about in the fall was this binding operational directive that CISA came out with for federal agencies, where it took the vulnerabilities that had been shared with us from industry and it looked at them and then shared those with the government, the federal agencies. CISA is responsible for defending the .gov, the 101 federal agencies, and shared what those vulnerabilities were and offered remediation and tactics for how to address those. And then finally, kind of taking that point, now when we're looking at Russia-Ukraine, CISA just put together a known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, which shows what are those vulnerabilities that Russia has historically exploited and how can we remediate them. So I think as we look at this, it's so important to see this evolution. And the success really comes from this active and dynamic relationship. We've talked about trust. That gets built over time. That gets built through constant communication and that sharing of information. And the challenge is, I'll share both what Wendy and Morgan said. We hit the challenges when there's just not that trust, when there's not that exchange. But we can't expect that to happen overnight. And I think this is what is particularly effective and successful, that we're putting in the work now to build those relationships so that industry wants to be a part, government recognizes what its role is to hold up its end of the bargain in that sharing of information, to really create, not just to prevent what we need to prevent, but to create a much more resilient infrastructure and a resilient digital economy.
Thank you. Do you mind going first on the next question?
Not at all.
Sure, okay, because it ties in, right? So given all of this and the points that we've laid out, if you could design, or what would be on your wish list for maybe public-private partnerships that don't yet exist today, or maybe they exist, but it's very fledgling. Maybe it's just an idea and it's starting out, or maybe you want to draw attention to one that kind of needs just a little bit more oomph, either from the public sector side as a good push, or a push from the private sector side and involvement. What is it? And then we can go over to Wendy and then Morgan for this one.
Well, I think when we look at the CISA products, when we look at what we do, we are only as good as the information that we're getting. And so last July, there was a national security memorandum on improving cybersecurity for critical infrastructure control systems. And we, along with our partner at the National Institute of Standards and Technology and other federal agencies, put together performance baselines for these critical infrastructure control systems. And we developed a document that we then released in January for feedback. And so we're getting feedback on producing these common baseline procedures, these guidelines. And I think that's just what's so important is that, I worked several years ago on the NIST voluntary cybersecurity framework. And I think that model of government convening, but by industry for industry, so it's a different type of collaboration, is so critical. And as we're looking at putting out products from CISA to help industry, to help small businesses, I think, Wendy's point about those businesses below the security poverty line it's a really important one. We've got to be thinking about what's accessible. We can't ask a small business to spend a lot of money on tech. We've got to think about how to meet small businesses where they are. All of those pieces get to this place where we really have to look at what does industry need and how can we solicit that feedback in an active way so what we're producing is valuable, accessible, and importantly, it's practical given the threat environment and resources available.
Great, great, thank you. So I'm hearing that you're trying to create some continuous improvement and feedback loops in there.
Absolutely.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, Wendy? You might be on mute, Wendy.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
I was speechless with my admiration at what Kirsten was saying. Yes, that there are so many things that we can do in public-private partnerships if we are able to establish these relationships beforehand or have most of the infrastructure already built so that when we need it, we can tap it. But as Kirsten was just saying, and as I like to say, I would venture to say the vast majority of businesses and organizations, nonprofits out there that are have to deal with cybersecurity are in almost no shape to do it, don't know who to work with, and won't be able to take any steps on it until they're absolutely pushed into it by an event, by some kind of incident. So, there's a vast majority out there that unfortunately can't be reached by public-private partnerships and can't benefit from them until we reach a critical mass of general security. I don't even know how to say it, but Chris Inglis mentioned, a cyber social contract. I like to ask about what we owe one another in the cybersecurity ecosystem, because it's not just a case of, what can the government provide? Everything else, the private sector is on their own. It's what can we all expect from one another, regardless of the capability we have to contribute to it. So we shouldn't just be asking very large companies, what can they do to make cybersecurity better, and expecting, smaller companies to just sort of figure it out. We have to raise the general level of security expertise in a way that it lifts everybody, regardless of when they come along, whether they're there now or whether they come along in the future.
Thank you. Morgan?
Yeah, I was actually thinking that exact thought, Wendy. One of the things that we like to say is raise all boats, right? And so we've got a extreme focus on certain sectors and certain companies, but that doesn't help all of the small to medium-sized businesses or utilities or lifeline services out there. And so we've got to figure out a way to how do we get to more people, which kind of leads me into, I guess, what I would say, I don't know if it's a wish list, it may just be a wish in general, is, I'm really hoping that we can stop the narrative about how certain public-private partnerships are different. Because in reality, when we talk about cybersecurity, we always preach redundancy because it helps us cover the gaps. And so I see value in every public-private partnership that I come across because they're communicating with their partners for different reasons in different ways. And what we're finding is that different types of information comes out of those exchanges. And so I see a value in all of those different things that are happening across every U.S. government and every different public-private partnership and forum. And I think that's one of the things that would be a little bit on my wish list is, as we kind of go through this and try to explode and really focus on operational collaboration and how we're doing all these different things. We talked about geek out sessions and roundabouts and big board meetings, as well as tabletop exercises. When we talk about public-private partnerships, it's chaos. I realize that, but it's time to embrace the mess because out of the mess comes a beautiful thing. And that is outcomes and relationships and trust, transparency and humility. And so that would probably be a little bit more of my wish, not necessarily a wish list for the future, but we are growing at rapid speeds and I really look forward to it. So.
Awesome, thank you, Morgan. So we've had two questions come in from the audience. So the first one is around, what is the private sector nervous about sharing with you all? What would you say is what is often kind of a deal breaker, or you get to the part in the conversation, but then they kind of back off and they're saying, wait, I don't know if I can share that. Do I want to share that? What happens if I do? any of you three, who would like to take that question? Anyone can jump in here.
I can jump in. I'll
Okay,
start.
then we'll go to you, Wendy.
Because I think, what we often see, and this is, again, this common theme of trust that's so critical right now, it's when we have the one-on-one discussions, when we build these smaller groups, playing off of both what Wendy and Morgan said, that it's about facilitating these conversations. Certainly, industry is afraid of being embarrassed. They're afraid of liability, all of these elements. But I think what has been, a real step and a real moment of progress is that as this trust is being built, you're seeing industry look at issues, a company look at something often bigger than itself. And it's this recognition that if there's a trusted environment with government, there's the awareness of what government can bring to the table, then sharing that information about a breach, about a vulnerability, will both help them, but importantly, there's this benevolence and this cross-sector of how it can help industry itself. So certainly with anything, when somebody has a vulnerability, there's this concern about, is this going to get out? What is my liability protection? And just mainstream, front page embarrassment. But I think what we're starting to see is that trust that's being built with government and the awareness that if you can share this, then we can do a much better job to protect the nation and really to protect the globe and the interdependencies.
I love the point that you bring up on when a company feels that something is beyond them, when they feel that it's in the greater good of the community interest. Wendy?
Yeah, this is a problem that we run into all the time in ISACs and ISAOs, that, an organization is not going to share anything that it doesn't absolutely have to. And this is why there's an issue of trust as to whether when you share that information with another party, whether they're going to take advantage of it, whether it's going to spread beyond what you wanted it to. And then the second thing is whether you have trust in the competence and expertise of the party that you're sharing it with, or that you're getting the information from, because I will see kind of a red velvet rope dynamic where some organizations won't share with other ones because they say either, well, the information we get from them is useless to us, so we're just not going to share with them. Or, the stuff that they're giving us is stuff we already knew, or we know it's wrong, and so on. So there's all of that dynamic in there. What I found, strangely enough, comes back again to individual trust, where an organization will share information that's sanitized to here and back. And as soon as they share that information, there are naturally questions that arise from whoever receives it going, yeah, I need to know something more about this. I have some questions. So if it's shared anonymously, this other party will come to me and say, can we talk to that other group? And because we have some questions. And so I will go to them and say, hey, so-and-so wants to ask you questions. And they go, oh yeah, we like so-and-so, we'll talk to them. So having that intermediary there is often enough to get the sharing back up to a level where it's actually useful. But again, that slows things down because having that human intermediary, makes a bottleneck. I don't know how to solve that particular problem, but I can promise you there are so many private sector organizations out there where people will be fired if there's any indication that they have shared information about a vulnerability or a breach with any government entity. So again, it has to be done unofficially. It has to be done at an individual level. It has to be in a deniable way. And it has to be in a way that brings immediate benefit to the party that's sharing it, because it's helping them deal with the situation. Other than that, just doing it for the good of the community, it is very, very hard to get a policy set up that the lawyers are going to approve of, especially for publicly held companies. That is so hard to do. So there are a lot of maybe templates or processes, procedures that we can work out, that we can encourage organizations to get pre-approved, to say, these are the kinds of information that we would like to be able to share on a regular basis. Here's what's going to be redacted from it. If somebody asks us, here's more information that we will give, and here's where we will stop. And if you can standardize that and get it pre-approved, maybe you can get a better flow going. But to be honest, I haven't figured out how to solve that myself.
No, thank you, Wendy. Morgan, did you want to take a bite at that one as well?
Well, I'll just add maybe a little bit of a different feedback or insights in terms of, so I talked about the fact that NSA in particular, our public-private partnerships at the Collaboration Center are focused on the defense industrial base. And so, you know, to be clear, the defense industrial base is the companies that hold contracts with the DoD. And so there's a contractual nexus there that makes people cognizant and aware of the fact that, oh my God, I'm going to be sharing something, but I have a contract with the Department of Defense. And our narrative here is simple. You have a nation state actor that's targeting you. We want to help you. You're building the capabilities that are going to protect our war fighters. And so, you know, nation state actors, especially when you're a very lucrative target, are not going to stop coming after you. And so we all need to team to better protect ourselves and better protect you, because we need those capabilities for the US military and for what we're trying to accomplish overseas. And so, you know, it's an interesting conversation. And once we can show that trust and that transparency and why we're here, is really helpful when we start to build those relationships. The second things I'll just add is, right, it's our industry partners. I'm always very impressed and appreciative of the fact that they want to protect their US customers. They want to build defenses that protect them from these nation state actors. And so once they, you know, see our willingness to share that information and then their willingness to put defenses in place, it all starts to pan out. So you're proving the model as you go. But I think it's just always trying to inch towards that success.
Can I just add one
Absolutely.
more? Building off of that, because I think this is important, and this really represents the last 12 months, is one of the things that we're doing with the JCDC is we actually have the operational representatives from the companies in the JCDC, the ones who are detecting it, the ones who have to remediate. And their willingness to share and to work with government is so strong because they would much rather be working with more minds on this than fewer. I don't disagree that when you get the general counsels at the table, when you get the legal frameworks, that's a different conversation. But that's why I think we've had a lot of success, because it's the engineers, it's the individuals who actually have to do that are coming to the table and are sharing that information. And they would much rather have the access to NSA's tools and to CISA's tools and DOD and FBI working with them to figure something out than to put kind of the legal firewall up in place. There's still a lot more to be done. There's absolutely a process here. But we've seen so much progress, I would say certainly over the last year, as a result of just the heightened threat environment.
Thank you. So I want to pull the thread on that a little bit around what I think you have going on with JCDC, and you have built a good culture that established trust and the mission of sharing details and having operational folks together collaborating in the trenches, that was the foundation that you formed with that culture. The question that we have come in from the audience is entirely around the concept of psychological safety. When we talk about concepts like, we want to test our exercises to the point that we fail. We want to feel comfortable failing in front of the US government. We want to feel comfortable failing in front of our competitors or our peers or whomever. There's a lot of culture that has to be baked into an organization to achieve the level of psychological safety that you want to have a well-functioning organization, okay, that's healthy, that's able to share information. Would any of you all like to talk a little bit about the concept of psychological safety? The point that Wendy brought up earlier, I thought it was so good, that what if you're put in a position where you want to share information with the US government, but you've got to get things in check with legal, or if you accidentally share information that you weren't supposed to, or someone maybe lower staff didn't know that they were supposed to share it. To what extent, as a community, do we need to work on this concept of psychological safety, that if you mess up, you're not going to get fired, the world's not going to fall down? What can this look like? Because I hear people talking a lot about culture, or about organizations saying we're creating a new culture, we're changing our culture. Culture takes years to create, and culture is about two things. It's about the behaviors that an organization or a community promotes, but it's also about the really bad behaviors that organizations tolerate over time as well. So what do we think about this concept of the psychological safety needed to really make public-private partnerships work? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy.
Wendy?
Wendy.
Okay, go Wendy.
Yeah, I was going to say, as our community goes, so goes the public-private partnership. And we see this problem with psychological safety every single day. It's built into the DNA of the security community because it's not just the breaches, because we see the sharks circling every time there is a breach. And if you are not very skilled in the right kind of humility and transparency that Morgan mentions, then you're just going to be eaten alive. But it's endemic even further because there is a whole sector of cybersecurity that is all about finding the flaws in what somebody does. There are all communities who their whole entire living is finding out how to break things or saying, "Ooh, you missed a spot." And when that is so widespread, it is really hard to build an enclave of psychological safety like at the JCDC to say, we're not going to play those games here. But it's still going on in the greater community outside. So we need a lot more. We can't just withdraw into small enclaves to have that safety. We have to promulgate the safety further. And again, as we've said, that involves not tolerating certain types of behavior.
Kirsten?
So psychological safety is a number one priority for Director Easterly and for CISA as we're looking at building out our culture. It's very much about how do you encourage the fundamental principles of wellness, of being able to take a risk with your ideas. And when we think about cybersecurity, it's all about innovation. And in order to be innovative, you have to really push yourself. You've got to be able to fail and where this comes from. And I think I'll take the question on a little bit of, turn it upside down a little bit. So there's the psychological safety of the relationships, but I think in order for the relationships to, both from the public and the private, the cultures themselves, the agencies, the companies have to promote that culture. So speaking from CISA's perspective, it's a priority. I mean, we have both the blessing of the curse of being the newest federal agency. We have a lot of individuals who have come from other places, but at the same time, we have a clean slate. And so to your point about it takes years to build culture, everyone comes with culture, as an individual. And we have this opportunity at CISA to build out what we want this to look like, what the principles are of this culture, what's the integrity, the ability to share. We talk about feedback as a gift. We have these 360-degree reviews that we're going to be starting. If the employees feel psychologically safe, then I think we get to a place where we can then act that way with industry and hopefully promote that through the vehicles that we have, like the JCDC and others. But it's certainly a priority. I think not just in public-private partnerships. I think it's something that we would all like to be able to bring into our lives, personally and professionally, and it takes a lot of work.
Thank you, Kirsten. So the next question that's come in from the audience is all of this talk between the government and the private sector on building these programs, ISACs, obviously CISA, JCDC, you all are beefing up a lot on this side. The question goes, do you think that you'll need additional resources? So as a former emergency manager, we classified this as people, money, stuff. Do you think you're going to need more people, money, and stuff to do this?
Well, I can't look a gift horse in the mouth because we just got $2.6 billion from Congress a couple weeks ago. So I think, it's always a matter of what do you work with? What do you have? How do you capitalize and maximize that? Certainly as this space is growing, everyone always looks for more resources, but you've got to be really disciplined in how we're looking at them, how we're prioritizing what we're doing. So always, in government, they always say more resources. I think where CISA is right now is making sure that we are taking the resources that we have, distributing them effectively for the priorities and the mission that we have. And importantly, how is that mission evolving to align with the threat? And what are we going to need? I think, the education, the training piece, individuals, I'm a big proponent of small business cybersecurity. I think there's always more that we can do. So I appreciate the comments that Morgan and Wendy have made. But we have the resources. We will always look for more because there's always more we can do. But it's just about what's that disciplined use of those to continue to be better and push ourselves to do more.
Thank you. Morgan?
If I could just add one thing, one of the things that we always emphasize here is specifically that it's not just about more resources, it's about the right resources. And when it comes to cybersecurity and what we're talking about, whether it's technical expertise or the ability to interact, you've got to really go out and find those people, and there's not always a ton of those people walking around. And we're all trying to build the same resources. And so I would offer to the same point is, always looking to grow, because there's a lot more work to be done in terms of resources and funding. But it's also one of those things where you have to think about, okay, I need to bring in the right people, because if you bring in too many people at once, it's really hard to establish that culture that you guys talked about earlier. And so I think it's a delicate balance as we start to move forward and start to take on more and more of these initiatives.
Great, thank you. So we've had a few more questions come in as well. The next one really involves, so we've touched on interpersonal trust, we've talked about psychological safety, we've talked about the various mechanisms that are standing up for the private sector to come to the table. This question from an audience participant says, what happens when they don't want to come to the table and the government needs them to? Is there any way, despite interpersonal relationships and everything moving at the speed of trust, and we all know that the relationships are what make it happen, what if someone leaves an organization, someone comes in to a company, and they no longer want to come to the table? The founder of Cisco Systems, Sandra Lerner, her famous quote is, "The first rule of every game is to know that you're in one." What happens if someone doesn't want to come to the game? Is there a way to hold them accountable?
I think from CISA's perspective, so much of this, as we all know the statistic, over 85% of critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. A lot of this is voluntary. A lot of this is through the trust. I think Morgan talked earlier about the one-way street. Wendy talked about the two-way streets and the roundabout. I think that, it is, you look for how do you foster that trust. If a company doesn't want to come to the table, and we've certainly seen this in the last year when there's been a breach or a vulnerability, when we're trying to get the information because we want to be able to see if there's a broader pattern, if there's a bigger issue at play, and also be able to share that information with other companies. We don't have the forcing mechanisms, but again, I do go to that point where we're seeing more companies recognize and step forward to appreciate the value of the engagement. I don't think you can force a company, but the hope is that you start to create a culture where that type of behavior is more anomalous than expected.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. The next question has a similar thread. Was there a particular cyber incident that occurred in recent years that you think really moved the needle in terms of compelling or pushing or getting the right level of attention to the need for public-private partnerships? Is there an incident that comes to mind? Morgan, you're laughing, so you've got to have something good.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so SolarWinds for us really was that changing incident. When we stood up the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, no facility, no capabilities, no really partners. SolarWinds hit, and we now have over 150 partners that we collaborate with on a daily basis, 2,000 interactions over the last 3 months under the Collaboration Center. And so we've definitely seen a surge. Obviously, we don't like to look at incidents as good things. But it was a forcing function, knowing that we had to get to a place where we were better sharing information and having that conversation earlier. And so I would say that was for us, if you want to talk about near incidents, that really drove us into this public-private partnership space.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add on to that. Obviously,
Sure.
SolarWinds is huge, but I think I'll add on to what Morgan was saying. It was so big because it really looked at supply chain issues. I mean, I had a lot of people in the public sector, certainly in media and communication, say, but didn't we know that supply chain was vulnerable? And so I think going back to our earlier conversation about exercising and testing for that which we're not expecting, it really raised this idea of supply chain security, which again goes to how important it is to ensure our small businesses are secure and that we're sharing resources and that they have a baseline level of cybersecurity. I'll also call out Colonial Pipeline just from the perspective that we saw it hit the kitchen table in a different way. You know, I'm from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we weren't losing gas, but you still saw gas lines at the gas stations that went for blocks. Not because people didn't think, not because there wasn't gas in the tanks, but there was that fear that we were going to lose gas. And I think for the first time in recent memory, we saw how something as esoteric and ambiguous as cyber was actually impacting the kitchen table. And I think these events, SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, as they've compounded over the last year, have done a lot to put cyber on the front page. And importantly, I think it's influencing how we're looking at the workforce, this interdisciplinary nature that we need in a workforce. We're recruiting more individuals that aren't just math, science, and engineering, but we're looking at sociologists, psychologists, economists, politicians, recognizing that we're going to need a more diverse workforce. And I think that development is coming from the fact that everyone is seeing, oh, cyber's something actually that I may be able to contribute to and I'm interested in.
Absolutely. I love it. So I think that we probably have time closing out. If there are any final statements from each of the panelists, if you don't mind, I'll start in the order of Wendy, and then we'll go to you, Morgan, and then Kirsten. But really, just any call to action, any kind of hot take, any punchline you just really like to send the audience home with today.
Well, a lot of what we've been talking about today in how to promote and improve public-private partnership has a lot of echoes in what a chief information security officer has to do in an organization every day, which is social engineering on a grand scale. And I like to say that, usually we think of social engineering as getting, somebody to click on a link. And, if you manage to do that, I'm not really impressed. If you can get 1,000 people to stop clicking on a link, then I will be really impressed. I think being a chief information security officer is one of the hardest social engineering tasks there is. And it just becomes even larger when you are trying to do this on a national or even a global scale, which is why I think the Cyber 912 challenge is so important, why I think CISA's mission is so important, and that of the NSA and the other agencies, because getting people to do the things that they may not see are a priority or are not a priority, it is still very, very hard to do. And if you think about it from a business perspective, there is no point in doing something or expending effort or expenditures before you absolutely have to do it, which is why we usually have to see a breach before it prompts people to act. And that's just prudent stewardship of, whatever resources you're working with, not to use them before you absolutely have to. So it's that timing, riding those waves, that we do as people who are trying to improve cybersecurity across the community and across the world, waiting for those right waves to happen and then taking advantage of them. So for everybody who is out there doing that, I salute you, because this is a really hard task.
Great. I'll just say it does not escape me that 2 years ago, having someone from the National Security Agency on to talk about public-private partnerships and all the things we're trying to do at the lowest classification possible is a natural thing. It's likely not something we would have been doing. And so, we recognize that it is our time to step out from the shadows and play the position that we are meant to play in the cybersecurity sport. We are here. We're excited, whether through it's the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center or in collaboration with the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And so want to thank everyone who's been willing to partner with us as we go through this. And when I think about public-private partnerships, again, it comes back to trust, transparency, humility, and embracing the chaos. And so thank you again, and thank you to the panelists for the great conversation today.
Kirsten?
Thanks, Megan. Well, I first just want to thank the panelists. Thanks for this discussion. It's been fantastic. And for the Cyber 912 challenge, because I think what it really highlights is the point that I want to end with, which is, cybersecurity is about people first. We often think about technology. We think about all of these other elements, but it's really about people. It's about the trust that you build. And we always have a long way to go, but when we look at where we've come even in the last year, I mean, I think CISA's collaboration with NSA, grateful for the partnership. And to Morgan's point, nobody knew what CISA was a few years ago. There are probably plenty of people who still don't know what it is, but it's at least out there a little bit more regularly. But the idea that we are only as good as the partners and those with whom we're working, both from government and industry. And so we are open. I think the comment that Morgan made about humility is so important. We come to the table extremely humble because we only know a piece. That's where we sit. And so our role is to facilitate, to build trust, to build partnerships, cooperation, and to continue to do that, and building that trust across sectors, across the government agencies is going to be so critical. But it's what we all need as we're looking to build out this more resilient and progressive and innovative workforce and an innovative economy.
Kirsten, thank you so much. Morgan, thank you. The incredible Wendy Nather, thank you so much. On behalf of the Atlantic Council and the Cyber 912 Challenge, thank you all so much for being with us today.